Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with Chris Taylor, the CEO of Actionable.co. Actionable.co is a company which is helping organizations to measure the impact of all the investment they've made in learning and development. And there's a lot of commonalities with what we do in the meetings and event industry. Enjoy the conversation with Chris Taylor. Hello, and welcome to a new episode of the Business of Meeting podcast. And today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with Chris Taylor. Chris is the CEO of Actionable.co. And if you want to know what they're doing besides going to their website, basically they're helping corporations measure all the impact of the millions of dollars that are invested in learning and development. So absolutely crucial. And we're going to talk about it. And we're also going to talk about what it takes to be an entrepreneur and develop a business. Chris, thank you so much for being here today.
Eric, it is my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So first thing first, what's your story?
How much time do we have? What is my story? I'll give you some highlights. I've been an entrepreneur since I was 12, started my first business when I was 12. I went to film school, thought I was going to be a film producer, realized that that's hard and not a path that I was particularly well suited to. So I thought I'll go make my millions elsewhere, then I'll come back and make movies. I moved into sales and marketing, fell in love with sales leadership and the art of sales in general. Ran a business in my early 20s that went really well. The success went straight to my head. I became extremely difficult to work for. The business fell apart. In my parents' basement, which in your mid-20s is sort of the pinnacle of failure, or it was for me. Licking my wounds, started reading a lot, trying to figure out what had gone wrong with this empire. And became really disenfranchised with the consumption of information. I was reading more than anyone and nothing was changing. And so I became, at that point, really fixated on how you apply new learning in a way that creates lasting behavior change. That turned into a training company, turned into a licensing business, and then ultimately turned into the software company that is Actionable, all really sort of satisfying my deep desire to quantify and to build systemic improvement around the application of learning. So that's the journey. Wife, 2 kids, live in Toronto, spend time in Australia.
Wow. I wish I could summarize like this when people ask me that question. Wonderful. I love reading as well, a lot. And what I'm missing sometimes for myself is I'm telling myself, okay, Eric, it's very nice. Now, what are you doing with that? How are you executing on that? What are 2 or 3 books that really impact you and maybe inspire you in what you're doing today that you're actually implementing?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to go there. I want to address that point though. I have a love of reading. And I think that's great, right? To enjoy sort of the written word and how ideas are organized and crafted and to hear the voice of the author is a recreational activity that I think sadly is slipping. And I think more of us can and should lean into that. That is a different activity to me than the application of learning, where the focus of the book is to put concepts into practice. I think those of us that read a lot, you know what mindset you're going into when you pick up a particular book, right? This is something I want to action, or this is something that I want to enjoy. Ideally, it's both, but if it's around action, there's a different set of tools and a different mindset that needs to come, in my experience, needs to come into play in order to, increase the likelihood that we'll create change. Some of the books that have had a substantial impact on me, I'll list off a couple in a sec, but I do find that it's interesting, right? It's all about the right book at the right time for the right person. Because I've had books that felt like they were game changing for me, and then I've gone back 3 or 4 years later and gone, why? What was it about this book? And vice versa, right? Things that didn't really land the first time and then really, hit home for me later. Seth Godin's Linchpin was really influential for me for a couple of reasons. Dan Pink's book Drive was also quite impactful. There was a book that again, through the lens of sort of hindsight, I don't think it's particularly groundbreaking, but was for me at the time, which was called The 1 Minute Millionaire, which helped me sort of realign my view of wealth and wealth creation, and set me on the journey of what was Actionable Books and has since sort of become Actionable.co.
Wow, phenomenal. Dan Pink, Seth Godin, amazing people.
Yeah.
I personally like to read Seth almost daily
Yeah.
emails. Such a wise person.
Yeah.
That's really great. So you said that linchpin was very influential. Why? I'd like to know that.
Yeah. There's actually a couple of reasons behind that. So I had back then I had this website called actionablebooks.com. It's still around, but pretty neglected. But it was basically where I would post actionable summaries of these books that I was reading. And so an actionable summary was one idea from the book and two ways that I was thinking about applying it. So not a true summary, but rather, focused on application. And I'd gotten in the habit of emailing the authors after I posted a summary, basically just a note of gratitude, right? So I literally verbatim, it was, hey, blank, read your book, loved your book, wrote about your book. Here's a link. I really appreciate all your hard work. Keep it up, Chris. And some authors get back to you 6 months later. Some never did. Most do, and in a timely fashion. And Seth was one of those that was just always so quick to respond. Always, a couple words or maybe a sentence or two. But when I read what was right before Linchpin, can't remember. But just before Linchpin, I'd finished his catalog. I'd read all of his books and I'd summarized all of them and I'd sent him emails about all of them. And I was starting to realize that there was this multi-year gap between when the idea was fresh in an author's head and when it actually hit the shelves as a new release. And I became really interested in that, right? That these are, preeminent thought leaders and we're getting their freshest thinking, which is actually 2 years old. So when I finished the book before Linchpin, I emailed Seth, same email, but then I had a postscript which said, and hey, I just realized I finished your entire catalog. I don't know if you're open to it, but if you are, I'd love to come to you and sit down and understand what you're thinking about right now. And then Seth, who's never one to mince words, wrote back about 3 hours later saying, yeah, great. How about Wednesday? And I'm in Toronto. I had to look him up. He's in New York, north of New York City. And I was like, okay. And so I booked a plane ticket. I rented a video camera and I thought I should really try to get more authors. And so there was this upstart author at the time named Gary Vaynerchuk who had just published Crush It. And I reached out to Gary, who at the time would respond to anybody and said, here's what I'm doing. Would you be interested in being on camera talking about your book? Gary said, yes. And so 2 days later, three or whatever it was, less than a week, I'm in New York, Midtown with Gary, and then upstate or, a little bit up in Yonkers with Seth, recording these video interviews. And I didn't really appreciate at the time what that would do for my ability to get pretty much anybody after that, because I got both ends of the spectrum, right, between Seth and Gary. And so it became this 2-year pilgrimage of traveling around North America, interviewing authors about their latest thinking. So that was, not obviously the book itself, but sort of the catalyst for a whole new phase of my life. But the concepts from Linchpin really resonated with me in regards to my own thinking at the time around all the things that you needed to succeed in life that weren't being taught in the classroom. And Seth had put such a great label to it, and in his classic fashion, had put all this great language around it. And so I became really focused in the nature of my training company for about 4 years was on teaching employees what I called the salaried entrepreneur skill set, which by another name was the Linchpin. I just sort of packaged it and went a little bit finer into the detail. And so it really gelled with me. It became a rallying cry. I met some amazing people at the Linchpin launch that I attended in New York. And all of it because of Seth's graciousness with invitation and wanting dialogue as opposed to monologue, which I so respect from an author.
That's phenomenal. And you keep in touch with those people that you've met along the way?
Yeah, here and there. I think it's probably one of my regrets from the last 10 years is that we lived abroad for a bit and then we started having kids. And during that time, I let some of those relationships fade a bit. But yeah, I've interviewed Seth 3 or 4 times. I've interviewed Gary 3 times. I was in Dan Pink's attic, which I kind of regret not continuing that relationship because he, as we know, became very popular. So yeah.
Interesting. So you talk about training and coaching and all the learning development and God knows how many millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars organization are putting in that. I'm always reminded of this quote with the CFOs coming to talk with the CEO. and say we're spending so much on training those people. Imagine if they leave, and the CEO said, imagine if we don't train them and they stay.
Yep.
Which I think is brilliant. Now, how do you measure that as the center point of actionable?
Yeah.
When did you come up with the idea, and how can you measure the impact? And I want to go also into soft skills, because I can understand if you measure the impact on the sales training, for instance, but
Sure.
how do you measure soft skills in an organization?
Yeah, I mean, this is the $1 million question, right? I mean, the industry, the learning and development industry has been attempting to address this for the better part of 60 years. There's a model that some listeners might be familiar with called the Kirkpatrick-Phillips model, training evaluation. And it basically looks at, at the very base level, we've got participant satisfaction. Did they enjoy the session? Then you go up a layer and you're looking at knowledge retention, surveying them a few weeks later and seeing how much they remember from the session. And we've all seen, there's this thing called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Even if you don't know the name, it basically shows that within a couple of days of the event, we've forgotten 90% of it, right? So there's been a big focus in the industry over the last 15 years around knowledge retention. How do we help people hold on to this information longer? I have the dubious benefit of coming into this industry as an outsider. I don't have formal instructional design training. Yes, I ran a training company, but I started it. I never worked inside, sort of an institution, if you will, which, probably counted against me for the first 10 years or so. Now I've been at it for 2 decades. Most people don't care anymore. But it's interesting because I looked at the focus on knowledge retention and thought, who cares? Bluntly, like if we're just taking up space in our brain, but we're not doing anything with that information, what actual value has that created for the organization? And when I came across Kirkpatrick, again, sort of 15 years ago, I became really interested in level 3, which is behavior change. How do individuals start putting the content into practice? Then you go into business impact, level 4. Then you go into true ROI, level 5, right? The holy grail of being able to show on a dashboard 100 grand in equals 500 grand out, right? Sort of marketing metric-esque. But just like marketing metrics or manufacturing metrics, there's complexity to coming to that simple answer, right? Of showing an ROI in a single digit. And I think that's often what gets overlooked or missed by folks that would like to measure the ROI of training, but they don't, I don't know how to say this kindly, but some of them just don't want to do the work of all the pieces that go into it below it. And some of it don't appreciate that that's necessary. They want to see the equivalent of a return on ad spend. It's like, great, but even that return on ad spend in marketing land has a whole bunch of metrics that need to be calculated to funnel up to that, right? So that's a bit of my soapbox for context. But you asked the question of how do we measure impact? Piece number one is actually getting clear on what is impact. Like, what impact are we trying to create? Because it's an easy thing to throw around, right? Show me the return on investment for this training program, or show me the impact of the training program. What does that actually mean to the stakeholders? Is it a KPI? Is it a dollars and cents thing? Is it around certain behaviors? We need to first identify what level on Kirkpatrick we're actually trying to measure to. But then these layers of Kirkpatrick stack, right? Behavior change, that third layer, to me, is the catalyst. And I say to me, we now have tens of millions of data points that justify this. But basically being able to say, when Eric attends a training program around how to be a better leader, and he learns how to be a more empathetic leader because he learned about certain listening skills, right? We're down into the content weeds. The CFO wants to know, how is this investment in Eric's leadership program actually showing a return on investment? We might say it's around employee retention. The people that work for Eric, we want to hang on to them longer and we want them to promote faster through the organization. Right. Okay. So can we measure that? Probably. Retention is something that gets measured internally. It's not about measuring the impact. It's about connecting the dots between the event and the outcome.
Right. Totally.
And so the behavior change element of Eric attending the session, wanting to be a better listener in order to become a better leader, if we can focus on supporting first and measuring second Eric's attempts to become a better listener, then we can start to actually shine a light on that black hole between events and retention that existed previously. If we can start to look at, is Eric practicing on a regular, i.e. daily basis, actually being a better listener, as self-reported, as reported by his direct reports? we can start to quantify the behavior change that's taking place and then link it retroactively to the employee retention. And that ultimately is the nature of the work that we do with Actionable, is we focus on sustaining and measuring the behavior change so that it can be linked to existing KPIs, so that we can say, here's correlation, if not causation, a whole bunch of correlation. So you can see that these people attended this training, then they engaged in these behavior changes. And of those that realize behavior change, we can see an improvement in metric X, in this case, employee retention.
That makes a lot of sense. You mentioning the also surveying the colleagues that are working with. So there's this bias where, let's say you and I are colleagues.
Yep.
And you come to me one day and said, Eric, it annoys me when you do X. And I say, okay, Chris, I'm going to try not to do that anymore. And the first day I don't do it. And the first week I don't do it. And for 3 weeks, I don't do it anymore. And on the fourth week, once I do it. And in your mind, you go, is at it again. We're forgetting that the 3 weeks of effort.
Yeah.
Is that taken into consideration?
Yeah. So our focus with Actionable is actually around the self-reporting. As a third-party observer, I'm more interested in seeing what Eric was thinking and working on for the 3 weeks leading up to that incident than I am in that person's one response to that one incident 3 weeks later. And yet we get regularly clients who are going, yeah, but it's self-reported, so it can't be trusted. To me, lagging indicators, lagging as in after the fact, need to be dialed in from an accuracy standpoint, as in retention numbers. Like, we need to know if people left or not, using our example from before. But leading indicators are by nature indicative. We don't need them to be absolute. In fact, absolute doesn't really mean anything. What we need to see trend. And so the way that I would approach that is, first of all, we want to look at Eric's data. Then if we're doing a 180 or 360, as in getting your colleagues to weigh in, I would make sure that the questions are structured in such a way that it's not binary, is he better or not? Because, things, we improve gradually, not instantaneously. But I would ask the question of, over the last 3 weeks, how often have you seen this? Or have you seen an improvement in, right? And then I'd always take it with a grain of salt. Like, this is why you don't do a 360 with one person. You need multiple stakeholders to try to mitigate that one person who had one experience or is grumpy because they missed breakfast, right? But I always put emphasis on self-reported over externally validated, because to your point, external validation brings its own bias. And I think it's important that we focus on the individual going through change.
Agree. Thank you.
Actually, can I add one point to that, Eric?
Yeah.
What that I would make on that is that change is hard, right? And in most cases, when we're establishing a new habit, we get worse before we get better, right? There's actually a name for it. They call it conscious incompetence. When we're going through the change curve, we're going to get worse before we get better. It's so dangerous to ask for third-party validation on the success of change without appreciating where we are at in the change curve, right? If we ask too early, it might actually be worse than it was before, not because we're getting worse, but because we're going through change and it's going to take a bit to improve.
Hence the idea of measuring at a different time.
And on an ongoing basis, not snapshot.
You just published tremendous survey. What are the top 3 takeaways that people should know about it, and where can they find it? You have a link to share.
Yeah, we'll make sure you get a link to share it. Yeah, so the report that Eric's referring to is called Achieving Impact Certainty, ensuring that training programs realize, I'm getting the name of it wrong now, but what is it? What's the sub name to this thing? It's Achieving Impact Certainty, designing training programs that ensure behavior change.
Designing training program that impact behavioral change.
That ensure behavior change. We want to bring confidence that behavior change will happen to every training program. And it's interesting, when you introduced me and Actionable at the beginning, you said Actionable is about measuring the impact of learning, and that's absolutely true. But a critical component of it is we want to make sure that change is actually happening first, right? And then we're going to measure it. But let's make sure that we're actually amplifying the change and measuring it. And that's what this document's about. This report, we looked at about 39,000 individual commitments to behavior change. To the best of my knowledge, it's the largest study on corporate individual behavior change that exists. We do this every year, and this one in particular is really providing training designers or anybody who's driving change initiatives internally to consider some of the factors that go into making sure that change happens and all the data that backs it up. So a couple of the key highlights. One comes to how we communicate the information in the first place. Far too often, training programs become a knowledge transfer session, right? It's someone with the information pushing it at the people that are on the receiving end. And the sort of metric of a good value program is how much content can we jam into the time that we have. Now I'm using deliberately provocative language. No one would ever say that, right? But that's effectively what it becomes. Like, well, we need to cut out that module. No, you can't cut that out. Just do it in less time.
I've never heard that.
Yeah. One of the biggest factors that we've seen in people's willingness to engage with change is what I call the content context ratio. When you're sharing information with any group of individuals where you want them to take action on it, what we're finding is that it should be at minimum a 3-to-1 ratio, ideally a 5-to-1 ratio between content and context. I'll put that in real context. If you have an hour to communicate with somebody, you want to spend about 10 minutes, maybe 12, actually sharing information, and then 48 to 50 minutes giving them the time and space and questions to answer the question for themselves. So what? That's the question. So what? People are so overwhelmed, all of us, right, with how much we have to do and the information coming at us. We have to assume that change is not going to happen when we share information with people. Maybe if you're threatening their livelihood, but most of the time that's not the case. And so change will not happen unless there is a strong enough reason for me to want to change and that I have absolute clarity on how to change. Both those things need to be true. What often gets missed, and we see this in the data, in corporate communications or change initiatives at large, is the executive team shares why they feel it's important that the change happens. And let's assume that I'm not a cynical employee, that I'm actually sort of a reasonably healthy employee. That matters. I want to know why this matters to my boss and boss's boss. But at the end of the day, if I'm going to prioritize it, it's got to matter to me personally, right? Mm-hmm. That only happens by having the time and the space to reflect, to dialogue, to find my own so what around the content itself. So that's one of the big factors. I got lots more, but I'll also keep talking if you don't cut me off, Eric. So
no, thank you. I would like you to mention maybe one or two additional point on from the survey, which I read as very, very interesting. Sure. Before you do that, you remind me of a conversation I had. I had a corporate events agency for
yeah, of course. Yep.
And one of my clients was the CEO of a bank, and we're discussing and how I actually closed the client is that we had a conversation. He said, but help me understand what Ven can do for me. I say, well, you're gathering your top 120 people that are the people executing your strategy. He said, yes. And this is going to happen in 3 months. He said, yes. So imagine that you can measure in advance what they know about those 3 main objectives you're always talking about. And let's say that 60% know about it. The guy interrupted me and said, oh, that would be wonderful. And here I am thinking, he's the boss. He's got 120 people. His expectation of his own team is that if he had 60% of the people being able to mention the 3 main objectives of the bank, that would be great, which I thought was insane. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here, and obviously this podcast, The Business of Meetings, primarily for people in the meetings and event industry, is how using what you just said and meetings and events can actually integrate to help organization. And meetings and events, it's also one of the touch point, essential touch point in the organization. But then if you can measure over time, then you can really demonstrate the impact. So anyway, I was just thinking about that. Let me know what you think about this, and also add maybe 1 or 2 extra point from the survey.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm glad you brought that up, and sort of brought me back to the audience that we're talking to here. Because when you're in the meetings and events space, I think the word event is a dangerous one, depending on how we actually go about this. Because is it about the experience for the participants, or is it about creating real change? I'm not suggesting they're exclusive, but I am suggesting that you need to stack rank. What is the actual priority here? Because there are times when the experience is what it's all about. And I totally get that. And I'm not anti-fun. And if we're saying that this event is designed to drive impact, right, then we really need to lean into what it means to drive impact. And it starts with the fact that the event itself is the catalyst for the change, not the change itself. Right. If
Yes.
we're, I would suggest that if we're in the event and conference industry, we might be in the change industry. We're just going with a particular niche of that. But what would it look like if you're talking to your clients, not about, I mean, yes, of course, you need to get into logistics, but on the front end, if it was around what's the change you're trying to drive? How is this event the catalyst for that? And then how are you going to support the implementation of that afterwards? We work with a couple organizations that do this, right? They do executive offsites. They're more focused on the content than logistics, but it becomes around, when they work with us, it becomes around how do we convert this event into a sustainment program? And what's fascinating about that is it doesn't need to cost the client anything more, because you probably have 10% of the overall event spend that's going into something superfluous that could be applied to sustaining impact beyond the event. That would be my challenge to anyone in the space, is to ask yourself, if you're honest with yourselves, are there anything in here that could be actually, I'm not talking about reducing your bill, I'm talking about reallocating part of it to focus on sustainment instead of what's happening in the room, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's
but I couldn't help but smile, because that's exactly how we differentiate ourselves, and why I was having one of the top agency in Belgium, is because precisely we were not going into the logistical part, but why are you bringing everyone together? Why are you trying to achieve? What are the challenges you have in your company? And I would speak for an hour with the C-level executive in front of me before even going to the logistical part. Now, the one thing I slightly disagree with you is shifting the budget, because I believe that whatever the experience, if you create memorable experience, people remember better. But I mean, we're just playing on words here. I think we're mostly aligned on the impact it can have. But that's the whole thing, is understanding why you're doing it. And if you don't know, if you know why, then you can measure more easily. Actually, you can measure. If you don't know why, you cannot measure.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And I think, I'd love to, we need probably a pitcher of beer and we can debate this for hours, Eric. Memorable, huge, right? We want to get it where it's into a place of I'm motivated to want to change. And then we got to support it, because well-intentioned people leave a session going, I'm going to be a better leader or whatever, right? It's like, well, that's great, but you don't do better leader, right? You become a better leader by practicing certain things. You don't do the values, right? You practice certain things that make you live the values. So all those pieces. You asked for specific key points.
Yes, please.
Number one, and this is a particularly interesting challenge with large scale events, is we want participants to focus on one daily practice leaving the event. And you go, well, we can't do that. It's an ocean of information. We can't put it through a straw of a single behavior. But and there's a lot of great stuff. James Clear writes about this extensively, but the idea of habit stacking, meaning let's work on improving one thing before we work on the next thing and the next thing, as opposed to trying to change 5 or 6 things at once. I didn't get into it in the report, but it's sort of there. But we did a study a couple of years ago where we had about 6,000 people that were given the ability to make more than one commitment to change. And then about the same number, sorry, it's 3 and 3, 3,000. And then 3,000 that were limited to one. The people that were limited to one commitment to change, one thing that they were going to work on leaving the session, had about a 78% completion rate. Okay.
Yep.
If you look at the people that made 2 or more, any guesses as to the follow through of going from one commitment up to 2 or more?
40%, 30%?
It's 11%.
Oh my God.
11%. Like, we're just, as humans, we're just not wired to multiple changes at a time. And we found a couple studies since that almost exactly mirror those numbers. We're doing our participants a disservice, and we're fooling ourselves if we think giving people 12 takeaways from the session is going to actually drive change. If we're serious about creating change, we need to be rigorous in helping participants identify the one thing that they're going to change.
Wow. That's powerful.
It's crazy, right?
Give me a last one from the survey.
One more time. there's huge value. Okay, buddies, that's easy. So accountability partners,
Yep.
play a big role. We've seen in many cases upwards of double the likelihood of follow through and realize change just by having a person who checks in with you once a week. If you can find somebody in the group, it doesn't matter if they're working on the same thing or not, but here's the key. It's you asking them, like formally, and them agreeing formally to be your buddy. It's not, okay, everybody buddy up. It's actually saying, ask this person. It feels weird in the moment, but you can do it electronically too, but there's magic in the language of, will you support me in this? And someone saying, yeah, I got you. All right. Double the likelihood. And then I'll give you a bonus one, journaling, which again, I know sounds obvious, but if you can actually not just make a commitment, but then on a daily basis, a couple of days, a week, to identify, how am I doing with this commitment to change? Rate yourself 1 to 10. How am I doing and why? If you write a sentence or two, we're seeing, what's the exact math here? There's about a 60% increase in behavior change for those that journal at least once a week.
That's amazing. In terms of accountability, I do have an accountability partner for 4 or 5 years now.
Nice.
And to your point, it's very powerful. The thing is, if we commit to, I don't know, writing a marketing plan, you have to show it. It's not enough to say I've done it. You have to show it, and that makes a lot of difference.
Yeah, we'll disappoint ourselves long before we'll disappoint someone else, right?
Yep, absolutely. That's really, really interesting, Chris. Thank you so much, and then we'll definitely put the link in the show notes. I was thinking as well, you mentioned Seth Godin, you mentioned training. I read once a fascinating stat that people buying online course.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, I think the completion rate is under 10%. If I'm 3%, it's a disaster. So basically, you're selling course online, or you're buying course online, and you're just not completing it. As someone who is interested in helping people building their business, especially in the meetings and event industry, I'm always fascinating on the best way to do it. Now, I know that Seth Godin has a fantastic completion rate. I think it was like 85%. Is that correct? Of Alt MBA program?
Yeah, I mean, after the first 5 or 6 cohorts, he was saying that he'd flipped the ratio, that he had a 97% completion rate versus 3% of the industry norm. And there's a woman named Wes Cow who co-designed the Alt MBA with him. And then after she sort of got that stood up, then she went out and co-founded a company called Maven, which is a cohort-based program, basically taking a lot of the lessons from what worked at the Alt MBA and making it into a platform that others could leverage. And when it came out, I almost cried because in a good way, tears of joy, because what they were espousing, small cohorts, collaborative learning, inverted classroom, i.e. content shared ahead of time. The time in the quote unquote classroom is around discussion, not around one direction. All of those things so perfectly mirror what we see in the data within our own platform. And this is it, right? This is why I'm not a huge lover of most learning management systems. I think it's tragic, right? Well-intentioned people have spent gobs of money to put systems in front of their employees that most people don't use. The little talked about stat in the LMS world, learning management system, for those not familiar, basically the place where you go to consume content in your company, that they have a 9% utilization rate. Like 9% of employees are ever going there. And it's the exact same reason why so many of the self-directed courses fail, is because it's reliant on the individual to maintain their own momentum long enough to get through to the end and to overcome all of the hurdles that'll inevitably pop up in the meantime. The social elements, the cohort-based model, the spaced learning approach is really critical if we truly want people consuming and applying the content that we're putting in front of them.
I don't know the right word. I'm trying to find the right word. It's pathetic when you listen to what you're saying in terms of 9% utilization rate and the amount that is spent. And wow, there's a lot of improvement can be done there. You mentioned cohort and discussion in group. What is the ideal number or the maximum number of the ideal cohort?
So what we're seeing in our data is that single digit, ideally sort of 5 to 8 participants in a cohort, maximizes the impact. It's pretty consistent though. The more people you put in, the more people you put in, the more apathy you breed. So we want smaller groups where possible, and then shorter sessions,
Like what?
like an hour, two maybe.
Chris, I would listen to you for hours. It's really fascinating what you're doing. Really, I'm so
So,
glad I can talk to you on the podcast today. I'd like to end this conversation with your experience facing adversity, being a business owner.
mhm.
I always smile when I look at people that think that you start a business, it's a straight line until everything's
Right.
working well. Where we all know it's total BS and it's very tough. Can you maybe share one or two situations that you had to overcome that could also inspire the listener and what you learned from it?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. I'm almost 16 years in running Actionable. As I mentioned, I've been running businesses for the better part of 30 years in various shapes and sizes. And I mean, there's so many, right? I think I remember talking to an investor or potential investor once about 7 or 8 years ago. I was out. I thought we wanted to raise venture cap for Actionable. We didn't, it turns out, but at the time I thought we did. And so I was out there shopping and talking and mostly not listening because I didn't know what I was doing. But I remember, and I'll carry it with me forever, one VC giving me a homework assignment before the second meeting, which was to go back and capture all the lessons I'd learned in building the business to that point. I enjoyed it. I sat down, I wrote a whole bunch of stuff. And then I went in and I showed it to him. And as he's reading through it, he went, "Yeah, but where's the failures?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And I had honestly unintentionally sort of varnished everything with and then I cleverly did this, and then I cleverly did that.
Mhm.
And and he was looking for, where's the places where you fell down, and are you sort of humble enough to admit those, and are you willing to learn from it? And I can say categorically I was not at the time, because I honestly couldn't see what he was asking. And it took me a couple of years to get to a place of like, oh, that's what he was asking. So I think, in no particular order, some of the big ones for me, obstacles to overcome. I've jumped into business partnerships far too quickly without really thinking about A, what the end game was, B, who I wanted to work with from an integrity and ethics standpoint. I have spent money on things that I thought would generate returns years before they ever did. And I've spent literally years of my life building things that no one cared about. And I think all of it comes from a place of, I'm going to call it enthusiastic hubris, of believing optimistically that it'll work out because I want it to work out, even though I wasn't consciously thinking that at the time. I think the biggest lessons that I've gained in the last couple of years in shaping that is finding people in your life that can provide you with really kind of brutal, if you need it, feedback on the stuff
Mm.
that you're putting forward, knowing that they love you and that they believe in you and are willing to attack whatever it is you're putting in front of them, whether it's a marketing plan or a business proposition or a product that you're thinking about. I had inadvertently surrounded myself with people that would support me to a fault, and that wasn't helpful. I needed people that would support me by pushing back on me.
Mhm.
And I've worked really hard to, well, I mean, part of the reason that you and I know each other is because I leaned into this group that I felt would likely have people that would be willing to do that for me. And thankfully it's made a massive difference. So yeah, if you can find, well, I wouldn't say if you can find anybody who's starting or running a business, if you don't have that person or those people in your life, I would put it right near the top of your priority list, because that sounding board makes all the difference, and a real sounding board, not the yes man sounding board.
Yeah, it's wonderful advice. What is the toughest situation you had to face? One of the toughest situation you had to face.
I had a business partner go to jail 2 weeks after my first son was born. He also had all the money. So we had no money. I had no business partner, and I had a newborn. So that was a struggle. We were also in the middle of a major spend on development. So it's not like we were in a healthy cash place, because I had this runway that then disappeared. So that was rough. I spent 39 months not knowing on the first of the month how I would make payroll on the end of the month. 39 consecutive months. So that was trying.
Well, if you can survive that, I think you can survive anything.
That's what I tell myself.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, I cannot end the conversation without asking my favorite question that I learned from our common friend, Jason Gaignard,
Okay.
thanks to whom we know each other.
Yeah.
So when we meet with a bottle of champagne in 12 months, what are we going to celebrate?
I think there's a couple things in there, Eric. The one that's particularly business focused, and me and most other people on the planet, we capture a tremendous amount of data in the Actionable platform. A lot of it's numbers, but a lot of it's also words. Being able to put those two pieces together, utilizing machine learning, artificial intelligence, so that our clients and their clients can simply ask the question of the Actionable platform, what's driving change in this program? Where are the areas of opportunity? Where should I focus my meager time? And get a reliable answer is really the core focus for me right now in the platform. I'd like to believe that 12 months from now, we'd be celebrating at least a beta version of that as it comes out.
Very good.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
Awesome. So I wish I can measure the number of people that are going to listen to this podcast and are going to implement something that they learned from you and one thing that they need to implement. Chris, truly enjoy a conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks so much, Eric. Really appreciate it.
Chris, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing all those great insights. Very impressive as well, all the people you've been able to meet and talk to and learn from. And thank you for sharing all those insights as well. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to connect with me, please go on LinkedIn or join the Facebook group, www.eventbusinessformula.com/group. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your network. Thank you. Bye-bye.